The wedding planner had warned me 3 times that my parents wanted a few minutes on the microphone before the toast started, and 3 times I'd said fine, thinking she meant a blessing, a story about me as a kid, maybe an embarrassing anecdote about the time I broke my arm trying to ride my bike off the back porch. I did not think she meant what actually happened, because nothing in 11 years of being their daughter had prepared me for what my mother was about to do in front 240 guests, my new husband's entire extended family, and a 4-tier cake that was still sitting untouched on a table draped in white linen. My name is Reagan. I'm 31 years old, and on the night of my wedding, in a ballroom my husband Theo and I had saved for 2 years to afford, my mother stood up, tapped a champagne flute with a fork until the room quieted, and announced that before the toasts began, she and my father had a small financial matter to address with me. She said it exactly like that, a small financial matter, like we were closing out a lease. I remember looking at Theo first because that's what you do when something strange starts happening at your own wedding. You look at the person who's supposed to be your anchor now, and his face had the same confusion mine did, eyebrows up, lips parted slightly like he was about to ask a question he didn't have words for. Yet, my new mother-in-law, Diane, was 3 tables back, and even from that distance, I could see her sit up a little straighter, the way people do when they sense a scene is about to happen and they don't yet know if they're allowed to enjoy it or if they should be embarrassed for someone. My mother had a folder. That's the detail that I keep coming back to. The folder. Because you don't bring a folder to a wedding unless you've planned this. You don't tuck a manila folder into your clutch purse, the kind with the metal clasp, unless somewhere in the days leading up to the event you sat down and thought, I am going to need documentation for this. She opened it like she was about to read a will. My father stood next to her, hands folded in front of him, nodding along like a man at a board meeting agreeing in advance with whatever was about to be proposed. He's always been that way, my father, supportive in the sense that he supports whatever my mother has already decided. Never an opinion of his own that I've witnessed in 3 decades, just steady agreement with the woman who makes the decisions. Reagan, my mother said into the microphone, and her voice had that particular brightness she uses when she wants something to sound generous, even when it isn't. Your father and I have been doing some math. She actually said doing some math into a microphone at my wedding, and we calculated that raising you from birth to age 18 cost us approximately $240,000. I want to tell you that the room gasped, that there was some dramatic intake of breath like in a movie, but that's not what happened. What happened was silence. The specific silence of 200 people simultaneously trying to figure out if this was a joke and slowly realizing, 1 table at a time, that it was not. We're not asking for all of it, she continued. And she actually smiled when she said this, like she was being magnanimous, like this was the generous version of what she could have demanded. We think, given that you're starting a new chapter, a contribution of $50,000 tonight, with the rest paid over the next 4 years, would be a fair way to close out this phase of the family ledger. Family ledger. She called it a ledger. My mother had apparently spent some portion of the engagement period, maybe while she was supposed to be helping me pick out centerpieces, maybe during one of those long phone calls where she asked detailed questions about Theo's salary that I'd thought foolishly or just maternal curiosity, building an itemized accounting of my childhood. Diapers, school lunches, the orthodontist soccer cleats I wore for 1 season before quitting because I hated running. $240,000 apparently was the final number, and she wanted it read aloud in public at the exact moment I was supposed to be cutting a cake. I should explain something about my family before I go further because the wedding wasn't really the beginning of this. It was the ending of something that had been building since I was maybe 19 years old, since the year I first realized that my mother didn't see motherhood the way other mothers seem to. She saw it as an investment. Not in the soft, metaphorical way people sometimes use that word, where they mean they invested time and love and effort into a child the way you'd invest care into a garden. She meant it literally. She kept records. She had, I would later discover, kept records since I was in elementary school. Receipts, tuition statements, even a notebook from when I was around 11, where she'd logged the cost of my birthday parties year over year with little notations like Reagan's eighth oath, per spent, Lauren's mom judged the bounce house. Lauren was my cousin, my mother's sister's daughter, 4 years older than me, and the unspoken standard against which my entire childhood was measured. Lauren got better grades, or at least my mother said she did. Lauren was thinner, or at least my mother implied she was. Lauren's mother, my Aunt Carol, ran her household, in my mother's telling, with a kind of disciplined efficiency that made my own house, by comparison, feel chaotic and indulgent. I grew up being compared to a girl I genuinely liked, which was its own kind of strange, because Lauren herself never asked to be the yardstick. She was just unlucky enough to exist as a convenient one. What I didn't understand until I was much older was that my mother's relationship with money and with control wasn't really about money or control at all. It was about leverage. She needed to be owed something. I think some people are built that way. They cannot simply give because giving without keeping score leaves them feeling exposed, feeling like they have nothing to hold over the people they love if those people ever decide to leave or disagree or simply grow into adults with their own opinions. My mother gave, yes. She fed me, clothed me, paid for piano lessons. I begged to quit after 2 years and was forced to continue for 4 more. But every gift came wrapped in a small, invisible thread that led back to her hand so that she could, at any moment she chose, give the thread a tug and remind me where it had come from. The first time I really understood this, I was 23. I'd just gotten my first real job out of college, an entry-level marketing position that paid barely enough to cover my studio apartment, and my mother called to ask. Casually, she said, just curious, how much I was saving each month. I told her proudly that I'd started putting $200 into a savings account. She was quiet for a second and then said, well, I hope you're putting some of that toward paying us back eventually. We did spend a fortune on you, you know. She just let the silence sit there until I understood that she meant it, and then she changed the subject to ask if I'd talked to Lauren recently because Lauren had just gotten a promotion. I didn't think about that conversation again for years. You don't. When you're young, you file uncomfortable moments away in a drawer marked probably nothing because the alternative, examining them closely, would require you to ask harder questions about the people who raised you. And most of us aren't ready to do that until something forces our hand. What forced my hand was Theo. I met him at 26 at a friend's barbecue, and what struck me immediately wasn't anything dramatic. He wasn't particularly tall or particularly loud or doing anything to draw attention to himself. He was sitting near the cooler talking to someone about a kayaking trip he'd taken, and he had this way of listening that I wasn't used to, where he'd actually pause before responding, like he was considering what you said, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. I found out later that his parents, Diane and Walt, were the kind of people who'd helped him buy his first car, not as a transaction but as a gift, who'd never once mentioned the cost of his childhood as a debt owed, who genuinely seemed to delight in giving rather than tracking. It took me almost a year of dating him before I really registered how foreign that was to me, how I kept waiting for some invoice to surface, some moment where Diane would corner me at a family dinner and mention, lightly, how much Theo's braces had cost. It never came, and the absence of it taught me more about my own family than any single fight ever had. I brought Theo home to meet my parents about 8 months into dating him, and I remember sitting at that dinner table watching my mother work him over with the precision of someone running a credit check. What did his parents do for work? Did he have student loans? Was he the type to waste money, her words, on things like vacations or hobbies? Theo, to his credit, answered everything with a kind of patient honesty, not realizing yet that he was being evaluated less as a future husband and more as a future asset, someone whose financial trajectory my mother wanted to assess before deciding how much warmth to extend. She decided eventually that he passed. He had a stable engineering job, no debt, parents who owned their home outright. My mother started referring to him within weeks as a good match, the way you describe a sound investment, and I remember feeling a small, cold spike of unease at the phrase without being able to name exactly why. We got engaged 2 years later, and that's when the math really started in earnest, though I didn't see the full shape of it until the wedding itself. My mother began making comments scattered across phone calls over the better part of a year about how much she and my father had put into me. Not in a loving, reflective way, not "we're so proud of who you've become," but in the language of return on investment. We covered all 4 years of your college. You know, that wasn't cheap. We paid for your braces, your retainer, your wisdom teeth removal. That's a small fortune right there. Each comment small enough to brush off individually, but together forming a pattern I was too exhausted and too busy planning a wedding to fully interrogate. I told Theo about some of it in the vague, apologetic way you describe a family member's quirks when you're still hoping the quirks won't turn into something worse. My mom's a little weird about money, I said. She likes to remind us what things cost. Theo, being who he is, just nodded and said, some people show love through generosity and some people show love through tracking. It's not great, but it's probably not malicious. I believed him because I wanted to. I didn't yet understand that for my mother, it wasn't a personality quirk. It was a plan with a deadline, and the deadline was my wedding day, when she'd have the largest audience of her life and the maximum possible leverage, because what daughter wants to make a scene at her own reception? That's the part I think she miscalculated. She assumed that the size of the audience would work in her favor. that I'd be too embarrassed, too eager to keep the peace in front of 200 guests to do anything but smile and say we'd talk about it later. She'd base her entire plan around the idea that public pressure flows one direction, that the bride is always the one who has the most to lose by causing a scene. She forgot that I'd spent 8 years quietly preparing for exactly this moment, even if I hadn't known, until that night that the moment was coming. I need to back up and explain what those 8 years actually were, because the script of what happened next doesn't make sense without them. When I was 23, the same year my mother first hinted I should be saving to pay them back, I started keeping my own folder. Not out of some grand strategic foresight. At first, it was just self protective instinct, the kind of thing you do when a conversation leaves a bad taste in your mouth and you want proof, even just for yourself, that you didn't imagine it. I started saving text messages, emails, voicemails where my mother would casually mention amounts. We spent $6,000 on your junior year abroad, you know. Because some part of me, even then, sensed that I might need a record of what was actually said versus what my mother would later claim was said, given her tendency to revise history in her own favor whenever it was convenient. Over the years, that folder grew, not because I was plotting some elaborate revenge. I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about a woman who spent a decade engineering a takedown. It's a story about a woman who simply got tired of being gaslit about her own childhood and who started writing things down because writing things down was the only way to hold on to her own version of events in a family where the official version was whatever my mother decided it should be. By the time of the wedding, that folder contained over 100 screenshots, voicemails, and saved emails spanning 8 years. It contained the message where my mother told me, when I was 24 and going through a breakup, that I was too sensitive, just like your father's side of the family. No wonder Lauren never has these problems. It contained the email from when I was 26, where she'd CC'd my father on a message detailing with actual bullet points the cost of my wedding dress fitting versus what Lauren's dress had cost, implying I was being wasteful before I'd even gotten engaged. It contained, most importantly, a voicemail from 4 years before the wedding, in which my mother, thinking she was leaving a private message from my father, not realizing she'd misdialed and left it for me instead, said with startling clarity, "If Reagan ever marries that boy, we need to get our money back before the wedding, because once she's his problem, we lose all our leverage. We lose all our leverage." That's the phrase she used about her own daughter, not "we lose our closeness," not "we lose our influence." Leverage, like I was a position in a negotiation that was about to expire. I'd kept that voicemail saved to 3 different devices and emailed to myself twice, because some instinct in me knew, even back then, that one day I might need it, not just for my own sanity, but for something larger. I didn't know what that something would be. I just knew I wasn't going to let her erase it from the record the way she'd erased so many other things over the years, soften them in the retelling, recast herself as the wounded party, convince other relatives that I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who'd always had a chip on her shoulder. So when she stood up at my wedding reception with her folder and her itemized $240,000 and asked me in front of Theo's entire family, in front of my own bewildered bridesmaids, in front of 200 guests who'd come to watch two people promise themselves to each other, to start paying her back that very night, something in me went very calm. Not panicked, not embarrassed, though I could feel embarrassment trying to claw its way up from my stomach. Calm, in the specific way you feel when you've been bracing for an impact for years without consciously realizing it, and the impact finally comes and your body simply knows what to do. I stood up. I didn't grab a microphone right away. I want to be precise about the sequence, because people have asked me since whether I'd planned exactly this moment, and the truth is I hadn't planned the wedding specifically. I'd just always known somewhere in the back of my mind that if my mother ever forced the issue publicly, I had the receipts to meet her there. I stood up first, and the room's attention shifted from her to me, the way a room's attention always pivots toward whoever stands when someone else is still talking. Because standing is its own kind of announcement. "Can I say something?" I asked, and my mother, perhaps sensing she still had the advantage, smiled and gestured for me to take the microphone, probably assuming I was about to do exactly what she'd planned for, agree, publicly, to the terms, locking myself into a 4-year repayment plan in front of witnesses so I couldn't later claim I'd been pressured. I took the microphone. I looked at her, then at my father, then out at the room, at Theo's family, at my own confused but quietly tense bridesmaids, at my best friend Priya in the front row, whose face had gone the particular shade of pale that meant she already sensed this wasn't going to go the way my mother expected. Before I respond to the number my mother just gave, I said, "I want to share something else. Just so everyone has the full picture before we talk about ledgers. I asked the DJ, who I'd briefed exactly 40 minutes earlier, during a private conversation near the gift table, where I told him there was a small chance I'd need him to play a short audio file through the speakers, and who'd looked at me with the particular alarm of a man being asked to do something unusual at a wedding, but had agreed because I told him, simply, trust me, you'll understand when it happens. I asked him to play the voicemail. It took a few seconds to load. Those few seconds were the longest of my life, because in them I watched my mother's face shift from triumphant to confused to very slowly afraid, as she realized I was not holding a microphone to agree with her. And then the voicemail played, her own voice, slightly tinny through the wedding speakers, but unmistakably hers, unmistakably clear. If Reagan ever marries that boy, we need to get our money back before the wedding, because once she's his problem, we lose all our leverage. The silence that followed was nothing like the silence after her initial announcement. That first silence had been confused, uncertain, waiting for context. This silence was the silence of 200 people understanding, all at once, exactly what kind of moment they were witnessing and adjusting their entire read of the evening accordingly. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that because I think people imagine these moments as explosive, and mine wasn't. My voice stayed level, almost conversational, the way you'd speak if you were finally, calmly explaining something you'd rehearsed in your head 1,000 times without realizing you were rehearsing it. My mother just asked me, in front of everyone, to pay $240,000 for being raised, I said. I want to be honest with all of you. I don't think children owe their parents money for groceries and school shoes. I think that's called parenting, not a loan. But that voicemail isn't from tonight, it's 4 years old. My mother left it by accident, thinking she was talking only to my father, and in it, she made it very clear that the love in this family has always come with a balance due, and that the moment I wasn't useful to her anymore, the moment I belonged to someone else, she wanted to collect before the window closed. My mother tried to take the microphone from me at that point. I remember the brief physical tug, her hand closing around the base of it, her face doing this strange, rapid transformation from anger to performance, the practice pivot she always used when cornered, where she'd suddenly soften her voice and try to recast herself as the hurt party. Reagan, sweetheart, that's not what I meant. You're twisting. I'm not twisting anything, I said. And I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't let go of the microphone either. I saved that recording for 4 years because some part of me always knew I might need it. Not to hurt you, just so that if you ever tried to rewrite what happened, I'd have proof of what actually happened. I want to pause here and acknowledge something because this isn't a simple story, and I don't think my mother is a cartoon villain, even after everything. She did raise me. She did, in her own complicated, transactional, anxious way. Love me. I believe that, even now, even after the wedding, even after everything that came afterward. I think my mother grew up in a household where love and money were never separated, where her own parents made her feel, from a young age, that she was a financial burden, something to be managed rather than simply adored. And she absorbed that lesson so completely that she never learned another way to express care except through the language of cost and debt and repayment. That doesn't excuse what she did. It just means that when I think about her now, I don't think about a monster. I think about a woman who never got the things she needed most, to be loved without a price tag, and who, without realizing it, spent 30 years making sure I understood exactly what mine had been. But understanding why someone does something doesn't obligate you to accept it, and it doesn't obligate you to pay for it, literally or otherwise. After the voicemail played, the room did something I hadn't anticipated, something that I think surprised my mother far more than the recording itself. Theo's mother, Diane, stood up. I remember this clearly because Diane is not a loud woman, not someone who inserts herself into other families' business, but she stood, smoothed her dress, and said, loud enough for the tables near her to hear, I think we should let the bride and groom enjoy their wedding. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a speech. But it was a signal, the kind that ripples outward in a room of people who are waiting for permission to move on, and within a few seconds, the DJ, bless him, because he clearly understood the moment needed diffusing, started playing music again, low enough to still feel respectful, but present enough to signal that the room was supposed to keep living, keep being a wedding, despite what had just happened in the middle of it. My mother and father didn't leave immediately. They sat back down at their table, and for the next hour, I watched my mother's face cycle through what I can only describe as damage control, leaning toward relatives, whispering, gesturing in a way that suggested she was trying to control the narrative even as it was actively escaping her. My Aunt Carol, Lauren's mother, came up to me at one point during the reception, pulled me aside near the gift table, and said quietly, I always wondered why she talked about you the way she did. I'm sorry I never said anything. It was a small moment, easy to miss in the chaos of a wedding night, but it told me something important, that other people had seen pieces of this for years and simply hadn't known what to do with what they were seeing. The way you sometimes notice a strange smell in a house and assume it's something explainable until someone finally identifies it as smoke. Lauren herself found me near the end of the night while Theo and I were doing the rounds of final goodbyes, and she hugged me longer than usual. The kind of hug that carries an apology inside it that doesn't need words. "I never asked to be the example," she said. "I hope you know that." I did know that. I'd always known that. Lauren had been as much a hostage to my mother's comparisons as I had, just from a different angle. The angle of being held up as a standard rather than measured against one, which carries its own quiet pressure that people don't always recognize as a burden. The aftermath in the weeks that followed was not clean. I want to resist the urge to tell you it resolved into some neat redemption arc, because that's not what happened. And I think stories that pretend painful family ruptures heal cleanly within a few scenes are doing a disservice to anyone who's actually lived through one. My mother called me 4 days after the wedding, and the conversation started with her trying again to reframe the voicemail. "You took that out of context. You don't understand what kind of year that was for us financially. You embarrassed your father and me in front of 200 people. Do you understand what that did to my reputation in this family?" And I let her talk for a while, mostly because some old tired part of me still wanted to give her the chance to simply apologize, to say something like, "I'm sorry, I was wrong to do that to you," without conditions attached. She never did. Not in that call, not in the ones that followed. What she did eventually, after about 6 weeks of cycling through anger and guilt tripping in a brief, strange attempt at acting like nothing had happened at all, was send me a long email. 3 paragraphs, which for my mother is practically a confession, saying that she could see how the voicemail sounded bad out of context, but that she understood I was hurt and that she hoped we could move forward as a family. No apology for the demand itself. No acknowledgement that calculating my childhood as a debt was the actual problem, separate from how the recording made her look. Just a request to move forward, the way people request things when they want the consequences to end without doing the work of understanding why the consequences existed. I wrote back something short. I told her I loved her because I did, despite everything, in the complicated, scarred way you love a parent who's failed you specifically rather than completely. But I told her that I wasn't going to pretend the wedding hadn't happened, and that I needed her to actually sit with what she'd done. Not the embarrassment of being recorded, but the actual demand, the actual 8 years of treating me like an investment with a maturity date, before I could trust her around me and Theo without bracing for the next invoice. My father, for his part, called me separately, about 2 months after the wedding, and said something that surprised me more than anything my mother had said in the entire aftermath. He said, "I should have said something years ago." I always knew it wasn't right, the way she kept those records, the way she talked about what things cost. I told myself it wasn't my business to interfere, that it was just how she copes with feeling like she never had control over her own life. I'm sorry I let it go on as long as it did. It wasn't a perfect apology. It still came wrapped in an excuse, still positioned my mother's behavior as something to be managed rather than confronted. But it was the first time in 31 years that my father had said anything that even approached accountability. And I cried after that call in a way I hadn't cried at the wedding itself, because some buried part of me had been waiting my whole life for one of them to simply say out loud that what happened to me wasn't normal. Theo, through all of it, was exactly who I'd hoped he'd be. Not vindictive toward my parents, not pushing me to cut them off entirely, but steady, patient, the kind of person who'd quietly say, "Whatever you decide about your mom, I'm not going anywhere," which turned out to be exactly what I needed to hear most, because part of what made the wedding so frightening in the moment wasn't just the public humiliation. It was the small, irrational fear that maybe Theo would see my family disquantly, recalibrate what he'd signed up for. He never did. If anything, I think watching that moment unfold made him hold on to me a little tighter, the way you instinctively protect something you've just realized was more fragile in certain specific ways than you'd understood. It's been a while since the wedding now, long enough that I can talk about it without my hands shaking the way they did in the first few months. My relationship with my mother exists in a strange, careful holding pattern. We talk, occasionally, mostly through brief texts, mostly about logistics rather than anything real. I haven't fully closed the door, and I'm not sure I ever will. Because some part of me still hopes that one day she'll surprise me, that she'll call and simply say the thing I've been waiting to hear without qualification. I don't expect it. But I haven't stopped hoping for it either, which I've come to understand is its own kind of grief. Not for someone who died, but for the version of a mother I needed and never quite got, who exists somewhere just out of reach. Close enough to almost touch, never close enough to almost touch, never close enough to actually have. What I know for certain is this: I don't owe anyone $240,000 for being loved conditionally. I don't owe anyone repayment for a childhood that came with invisible strings attached the whole time, even when I couldn't see them clearly enough to name what they were. And I know that the version of myself who spent 8 years quietly saving screenshots and voicemails wasn't being paranoid or vindictive. She was protecting a version of the truth that she somehow knew. Even as a 23-year-old who didn't yet have all the language for what was happening to her, would eventually need defending. I think about that folder sometimes, my mother's folder, the one with the metal clasp, the one she brought to my wedding with such confidence that she'd calculated correctly that the math would simply work in her favor because she'd always been the one keeping score. I think about how she spent 30 years building a ledger she thought only she controlled, never imagining that the daughter she'd raised to track, to document, to remember exactly what was said and when, had learned that skill from watching her and had quietly, patiently turned it into the very thing that would finally make her listen.